Welcome to Communicating with Partners About Prevention, an excerpt from the Prevention Planning Roundtable discussion with child welfare leaders. I'm Sarah Vidrine from the Capacity Building Center for States. In this excerpt, participants share strategies for building community and partner understanding of prevention. Let's listen as they talk with one another about the importance of intentional communication strategies based on authentic partnership.
And this past spring, we launched an internal team to sort of support all of the agency stakeholder efforts, and we're calling it the feedback team. And so we meet regularly, and it really is the purpose of this feedback team is threefold, and it really fit in nicely with the work that we were doing with Family First, and really was to develop within DCYF internally a skill set on how to actively and engage stakeholders, and then really to document and share with leadership what our stakeholders were saying back to us, particularly of families and youth, the people with lived experience, and then really to make sure we're ensuring that we're closing that feedback loop, that we're addressing the feedback that we've received.
On the stakeholder piece, I think establishing a structure and really laying that out on paper so people can see where those feedback loops are, how Susan talked about, so that they know where those gaps might be and where we need to work on those. So once we had that dedicated person through me, we were able to really focus on making sure that we had everyone at the table, but also where they should be at the table at the right moment and the right time for those planning efforts. Because there's a lot of background stuff that has to happen, I think, around just writing the plan, the logistic pieces of that the stakeholders don't necessarily care to know about or want to know about.
When we first were, trying to make a decision about whether we were going to be an early implementer or whether we were going to request a waiver, we were hearing, especially from our judicial partners, there were a lot of misconceptions about what Family First meant. We were hearing things that indicated that there was concern that children were going to be left in unsafe situations. So we knew that if we were going to be an early implementer, we had to have really meaningful conversations and bring all of the stakeholders to the table early on. And we didn't want to just do that at a statewide level, but we really wanted to get out to the local communities. And so we conducted regional forums in all of our service regions across the state. And we invited legislators, our judicial partners. We had young people who had lived experience in care attend those, as well as birth parents with lived experience. It included a presentation of information about what Family First requirements were, so we could dispel some of those myths. We shared our own data in every region so that it was clear how implementing the Family First requirements could really be impactful and truly meet the needs of the families that we serve. We've seen bills filed in our legislature that are very punitive to birth families that seem to be disconnected or lack empathy for their situation. We've had concerns historically about poverty being seen as neglect. And I will tell you that over the course of those regional forums, I actually, just in statements made by, legislators that were present, I saw those views shift. You could hear those views shift in response to what they were hearing as the experience of birth families. I know someone earlier described it as a culture shift. I mean, I think we've seen a culture shift. Are starting to see that in our state in terms of support for birth families and having empathy for their experiences.
So we set up kind of a traveling roadshow and went out and to Yakima and Spokane and the four corners of the state to try to get input from stakeholders and community members, or EVPs that we might want to include in this plan, and the candidacy groups, and where do stakeholders and community members see this effort being useful, and where are the gaps that we need to fill as we work on this. So we did a lot of that up front. Same thing with tribes. We're able to attend tribal meetings and meetings with legislature. We have a very active stakeholder community in Washington, which actually is a great benefit to us.
Through the stakeholder process was really the way to start building, that communication and trust. But I think really sort of, and so we had several, meetings were really substantive, as to what direction we want to move in. And so we had a lot of feedback about our candidacy groups that we had initially come up with, a lot of discussion around that. We took that back and we made adjustments, so the next time we met, we said, we heard you, we considered, and we're making adjustments to our plan, based on that feedback. And then, and I know others had mentioned, we really did a deep dive as far as sort of what are the needs of our families, or we have 8 candidacy groups. Really, what are the needs and how can we match up the services to them with the limited amount of services that are in the 4E clearinghouse. But we did that, as many of you have said, through stakeholder work groups, and really had deep conversations, really, wanting to hear what are you seeing as needs, and then responding to that. It wasn't a unilateral sort of decision top down from DCYF, this is where we're going. There was a lot of back and forth. And I think that really has, really sort of advanced that trusting relationship. And believe me, we, it's certainly mixed. We had, our sister state agencies, we had, our providers, we had other folks, and the relationship has not always been wonderful, but I think this process certainly lent itself to sort of build that trust up as we move forward with our work.
One of the things that we did was we had this graphic. I don't even know where this graphic came from, but we had this graphic that kind of explained funding streams for prevention type services. And we used that graphic with stakeholders, with all kinds of folks, legislators, to kind of explain how the puzzle was funded. And we said, let's dream about what we want for strong families. And then let's look at all the different funding streams to figure out kind of what we might be able to influence. And so we kind of put all those funding streams on the table as areas of influence to improve prevention or strengthening families. And that helped people, I think, start to fit in, oh, well, I have this idea, or I have this thing, we have this thing that needs to be improved upon, but which system is it that actually could help with that? And I think that actually helped build a lot of trust, because we were kind of showing people the money, like, here's the money. And so how can we work together to get the outcome, but recognizing it's not all going to come from one space.
Now that you've had an opportunity to listen to these stories, consider bringing your team together to generate ideas about the kinds of communication strategies that could help foster trust and transparency in your planning process.
The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the Children's Bureau.